Hi, welcome to Promo Insiders, an ASI Media podcast that covers the issues that matter most to the promotional products industry. I'm Chris Ruvo, and I'm joined today by my colleague Sara Lavenduski. Sara and I are journalists with ASI, and we've both been covering supply chain issues of late. While things certainly are not at the crisis levels experienced at times during the COVID-19 pandemic, there are a significant number of challenges facing the global supply chain at the moment, and that matters for promo. Our industry relies on a global sourcing network, for one thing, and most promo products sold in North America are produced overseas, shipped here, taken in through ports, and then transported by rail or truck to supply our warehouses. And that's just to get the item stocked. Once orders come in, products need to be decorated, and domestic shippers then have to move the goods on to end buyers. It's a lot of hands in the logistics, which means a lot of opportunities for disruption, and there's definitely been some of that of late. So, Sara, thank you first off for joining me. You've obviously our lead cover of Canada, and there's been some issues up there lately, and I thought maybe we could start there.
Sure. So last week, which was a situation we had been monitoring because there had been rumblings of this, but last week, the two major railways in Canada, so that's the Canadian National CN and then the Canadian Pacific Kansas City CPKC. They own virtually all of the track across Canada, and then
Hmm.
CPKC was a merger a few years ago that actually goes down into the Midwest of the United States and into Mexico. So it connects the
Okay.
two continents, the two countries, I should say, connects the entire continent, all three countries. And there was actually, so there have been talks about a new contract. There's a lot of things that
Hmm.
workers on the railways want, they want improvements on. So we're talking wages, work hours, shift scheduling, fatigue management. And
Hmm.
last week was the deadline. So if they couldn't
Okay.
get a new contract, which they've been talking about for a year, by the 22nd, something was going to happen on the 22nd. So at midnight on Thursday, the 22nd, the railway said, don't come back to work. So it was a work
Okay.
stoppage, wasn't a strike. It was a work stoppage. So they locked them out. It's a lockout. They locked them
Okay.
out. Um, Already less than, I mean, it wasn't even noon on Thursday, and companies in our industry were already getting delay notices from UPS, from FedEx, from
Okay.
whatever logistics companies work up there to move goods from the rail. They were
Hmm.
already getting notices of delays. So very quickly, the federal government ordered the dispute to go to binding arbitration, which means that the railway workers have to go back to work while everything is still sorted out. The
Hmm.
railways are appealing the constitutionality of this because they say, this is affecting our bargaining power. Like if the government can just say, you have to go back to work no matter what,
Hmm.
what clout do we have? So
Right.
it's being challenged. So we're not out of the woods yet. I know that suppliers and distributors in this industry are relieved for the moment, but
Okay.
there were products coming. They were on the water. They were headed imminently, would be arriving at ports on the West Coast. And if
Okay.
you're a company in Ontario or Quebec, you have to get those goods from Asia over to
Hmm.
the East Coast of Canada, the United
Yeah,
States.
sure.
That's got to be railed. It's not
Hmm.
trucked. The
Hmm.
trucking lines cannot handle the amount of goods that are moved by rail. They don't have
Okay.
the amount of trucks, the amount of people. So they were scrambling to figure that out. Right now, it seems to be okay. They're still clearing out the congestion, actually. It's going to take about a
Okay.
week after like a day,
Yeah.
but they're still clearing out from that. But yeah, that was, companies were making contingency plans.
All right. So you said a ton of interesting stuff there. A couple follow-ups for you. Do you have any sense of um, how things might go with the appeal, for lack of a better word, by the unions? And is there a time frame on that? Because if I guess I would think if that's upheld, then they could strike, right?
They could. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they already had threatened to strike. I don't know the exact time frame for it. That has not really been publicized yet. They will appeal. I think the government is so their hands are tied. I know that Trudeau's government really wants to be on the side of workers. They
Hmm.
are, it's the Liberals. They want to be on the side of workers. I know the NDP wants to be on the side of workers. They had said we're not going to be sending this for binding arbitration. Well,
Hmm.
the Liberal government did. I don't know about time frame, but they're going to have to they're going to have to work it out. I know that the
Hmm.
federal government really wants the workers to be able to bargain as
Hmm.
that's their prerogative as unionized workers. But they know they Canada cannot afford to have
They
this
can't
kind of
cripple the
economic shutdown.
economy. That's what they're worried about. Is
Yep.
they don't want the economy crippled. There's obviously a knock-on effect for the people in our industry who, as you noted, were immediately getting delay notifications. 1 day's backup is causing, or 1 day's half stoppage really
Mhm.
is causing backups.
That's
Has
right.
there been anything, and yeah, I don't know how you'd know this, but maybe there was a report somewhere. Has there been anything? Sometimes, even if they're ordered back to work, sometimes workers will say, "Well, I'm gonna kind of do the bare minimum here." As part. Has there been anything like that, like efficiency concerns yet, or is that not really known?
Yeah, I mean, I have heard, I have in some commentary about the situation. Yeah, they're not loving the fact that they've been ordered off the picket lines back to work. So that
Okay.
is something that they're going to have to contend with. Kind of
Okay.
the the morale, I guess there's a kind of a retaliation aspect to it where they're not going to, there may be some, lack of, like you're saying, lack of efficiency,
Okay.
just in response to this move by the government. Yeah, that's something they're concerned with for sure.
Okay. All right.
Hmm.
Interesting. And I think you made a point in there that I think it was at least one of the rail lines runs down into the Midwest, and
Yeah.
the Canadian and U.S. economies are obviously very interconnected in a lot of ways. Logistically, the two economies have very significant interties. So, is there any more that you could speak to just how, if at all, what's going on in Canada maybe spills over to U.S. problems too?
Oh, for sure. I mean,
Mhm,
it's beyond promo, obviously. I mean, we get fertilizer from Canada.
mhm,
So that's the
mhm,
ag sector. We get car parts from Canada.
mhm,
So automotive manufacturing would slow or shut.
mhm,
We get lumber. And
mhm,
for construction, we rely so heavily on Canada for raw materials in that area. So
mhm,
yeah, there are, major industries here that if there was a prolonged stoppage,
mhm.
we would definitely feel it here for sure. Retail, I mean, name it, we would feel the impact.
All right, and there.
Pharmaceuticals, yeah.
Okay, and there's obviously then a knock-on effect for the prom. Even if hey, I as a supplier or a distributor am not importing product that's coming through Canada rail lines themselves, my customers, as you just rattled off a bunch of industries there, a bunch of end markets might be doing so, and if they're negatively affected by this, that's gonna detract from their ability to invest in promotional products or even to
100%.
focus on promo spending. So
Yeah.
there is all kinds of knock-on implications to what's going on in Canada for both the U.S. and the Canada,
Hmm.
and I should say, excuse me, for industries beyond ours that we serve. So
Sure.
just all interesting to keep in mind. I mean, on that, we have another domestic or potential domestic issue on supply chain. It was interesting, right? During the COVID era, so much of what the challenge was seemed to be coming from abroad, and then once it got here, there was problems at ports, and those ports are now in focus again, particularly on the east and Gulf coasts of the U.S. Where, as we record this, we're at the end of August. As of right now, the largest port workers union in the U.S. is threatening to go on strike as of October 1st if they do not have a new contract in place. The word that we're seeing is that they want a 32% pay rate increase over the course of that roughly 5-year contract, and the two sides are very far apart. They're not even talking at the moment. So this is a whole other supply chain thing that kind of came up. You're thinking about the Canadian rail situation domestically, and then we're like, holy smokes, that's right. This massive potential strike is only a month away. So that's something that suppliers in our industry have also been dealing with, where they're trying to preemptively maybe reroute some shipments or bring in more product ahead of time to in advance, I should say, of the autumn when they might normally have brought products in. They've now brought it in over the summer or trying to get it in early September because they're worried that there's going to be this this stoppage on the east and Gulf Coast. So I just wanted to make that point that there's this whole other huge dynamic in play here, and kind of with that on some of the supplier actions. I know you've been doing some research about Q4 and gifting. It's obviously an incredibly pivotal period for our industry, the holiday gifting time. What have you been hearing from suppliers as far as their readiness with inventory, given all some of the supply chain concerns we've talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think if there were to be like, and if we're not out of the woods yet, if there were to be
Mhm,
a strike at the ports and a work
mhm,
stoppage at rail in Canada,
mhm.
like, because you can't reroute, you wouldn't be able to reroute ships
Yeah,
from the East Coast here to the East Coast of Canada. They have Montreal, Halifax, etc. There's no rail to move the product. So
there's
that would
nothing.
be
Okay.
it would be chaos.
Yeah.
Right now, suppliers and distributors, they told me like they are so used to disruption after the
Hmm.
past 4 or 5 years.
Hmm.
They're just so used to it. It's just become part of their business to prepare for it. So they seem
Hmm.
pretty confident about Q4. A lot of it's out of their control. So I think,
Hmm.
the things that are important every year are important this year. It's get your orders in early,
Hmm.
make sure your inventory is secured, your production timeline is secured, communicate with clients about, what's
Hmm.
feasible, what's not, expectations, timelines as far as when they have to order to make sure that, their gifts are arriving in time for the end of the
Hmm.
year. Um, they're pretty confident that they can handle disruption. Um, but I think it's absolutely it's going to be communication, keeping those lines of communication open.
Hmm.
Definitely, if possible, present alternatives for your clients that they've approved. So in case something
Hmm.
is, inventory is gone until March,
Hmm.
whatever it is, make sure that there are other options on the table. But for sure, like suppliers and distributors seem pretty confident. I know, like, and
Hmm.
well, like the first half of the year was pretty soft.
Hmm.
So they really are looking forward to a good Q4. So they're going to make sure that they do whatever it takes to make that happen. But still, in tandem, there are things that are obviously outside of their control that they are having to account for. But
Yeah.
yeah, so far the vibe has been pretty confident that they're going to be able to do what they need to do.
Okay. All right, and
Yeah.
that's interesting because that does check out with some of the reporting I did this week. We had a story on hey, how what are suppliers doing? What are they thinking about this potential port strike on the east and Gulf coasts?
Hmm.
And the word that I got from and I talked to quite a few was that hey, we feel that our stock position is in a good place. We're confident that we're going to have enough for the Q3, Q4 gifting period. Are we worried about a potential strike? Of course, we're worried about it. Are we taking some of these proactive steps, like I mentioned before, like getting more inventory stateside farther in advance, stocking up the whole bit, maybe even rerouting some shipments to different ports? Yes, they're doing all those things. So all the advice that you gave for distributors there on how to react, I think is fantastic. And as distributors do that, I think it's good that we try to create clarity that suppliers are trying to control what they can
Hmm.
control in this situation. Ultimately, they can't make the unions or the union and management agree to a contract.
Right, right.
Um, a couple interesting perspectives I had on this because people have asked, do you really think they'll strike? And it's a cloudy crystal ball, but there's a lot of people that feel, hey, that strike would come a month or so before a presidential election in the U.S. Do we really think the federal government would quote allow that to happen? Now, without going into all the ins and outs, in the U.S., the federal government doesn't have as much power to just say, hey, you got to get your, what's back to work.
Hmm.
Um, if there's a strike, but they can come in and help broker deals, which did happen recently, just a couple years ago on the West Coast, where there was federal government intervention that helped broker a deal there between port workers and management. So there's some who are saying, hey, we think that the federal government would do something similar here, that they wouldn't allow it to go to a full-blown strike, which would obviously be great for our industry because the ports would continue to operate. Still, we ultimately need to see how it all plays out. There's other supply chain things, and is there other things you've been covering though to yourself, or that you think we should discuss here, just about what's going on in the global supply chain? I have a few in mind, but I'd love to hear your
Yeah.
thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think like I know you had an amazing report on the European market
Hmm.
this week, which it's interesting because I thought that the Red Sea situation with the
Yeah.
Houthis and basically the Suez is like at a fraction of the ships coming through that it normally does. And
Hmm.
I thought, oh, when I was researching Q4, I'm like, oh, companies must really be feeling that impact right now as far as delays because ships have to go all the way around Africa instead of going through the
Hmm.
Suez. But and it is interesting because in your report it reiterated this. It's actually the European counterparts who are feeling that more at the
More.
moment, right?
Yeah.
Because they get so much more through the Suez from Asia into the
Mhm.
Mediterranean, which makes sense.
Totally.
But I that situation has been going on since late last year, I believe.
Yeah.
The Houthis have basically taken control of that waterway. There was a huge ship fire this week. That's going to be an
Yeah.
environmental disaster, not to mention
You're
everything
right.
else, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Um, but I think we're going to start, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like we're going to start feeling that, like
Yeah,
it's
I
got to
think
some way down the line.
so. I think your observation is 100% right on that our counterparts, I mean our promo counterparts in Europe are feeling this more because that's their main supply route from Asia through the Suez to Europe to get products produced in Asia. So they're definitely feeling it more immediately. That said, though, we are and have been feeling it in this sense that that longer voyage increases overall shipping costs. And those shipping costs, it's basically only a few companies, right, running global shipping. So they're spreading costs out everywhere. And that gets felt in shipping lines that service the North American market, even if they're going nowhere near Africa or the Suez, if they're coming from Asia to the West Coast, there's still knock-on effects for costs. The other thing too is that because it takes longer to get from to come from East Asia and then go around the southern tip of Africa, containers are at sea longer, so that reduces cargo container availability. And what happens when supply of something is reduced and there's demand? The cost goes up. So just between you call it the end of May and right around the end of August, there was a 45% increase to ship from East Asia to the North American East Coast. All of that's tied to things like container shortages, to increasing costs tied to longer journeys, etc. So there is this incredible interconnectivity to the global supply chain that affects us from just a cost perspective. Now, a distributor might say, yeah, that's why do I care? Well, because if suppliers are consistently dealing with more expensive shipping, some of those costs ultimately get passed along. It's just a reality. So it's an interesting thing to note there. I'll ask you this: have you been up on the situation in Bangladesh as well? The whole do you want to speak to that at all? We could talk about that because that's a whole other issue going on.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting, we talked in State of the Industry about how we're trying to diversify
Hmm.
in this industry from where we're sourcing from. And I know Bangladesh has really been growing, especially for apparel.
Hmm.
Um, but I also know that some of these places where we try to diversify to have some intrinsic, perhaps, issues in them, social issues, things
Hmm.
that they're working out as a people. In Bangladesh, it's been pretty violent. There have
Hmm.
been protests and deaths, and so these countries that we're diversifying to, there's a reason why it's hard to break
Hmm.
away from the typical countries like China is number
Yeah.
one, right? Like it's, and I know it was an article from SOI, which I believe you wrote, where it was like, during COVID, it was like we really have to diversify away from China. Now it's like it would be
Yeah.
nice to, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And it's like
But
and
how? Yeah.
right, but how? And China is our workshop, and China has the expertise and the infrastructure. And I do think diversifying is a good thing, but we there are these obstacles that we have to contend with. And I know that there have been companies who have moved to Bangladesh and moved operations there, but there are challenges to that.
Yeah, for sure. And covering the Canadian market as you do, Gildan, obviously based in Montreal, is making a
Yeah.
big put. They've built a facility, or they're setting up a facility there where they want to actually move a lot of their basics production to there, because
Yeah.
they feel like there's enough infrastructure in place and the costs are going to be less. All that said, though, you're dealing with some instability, some political and social instability,
Yeah.
as you point out, and some of it quite violent. And then there's also just been flooding. There's been catastrophic flooding in the country too. That's snarled things. So it's very significantly affected apparel production in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is now one of the largest apparel producers in the world. And when things go back online, it's are is a promo supplier going to be a promo supplier doing, a few $10 million worth of business a year, going to have higher priority over a massive retailer who needs to get their, no, they're not. So there's a chain of startup to deal with too, that creates inefficiencies and challenges. So it's something to keep in mind as we go. Now, I should say that a lot of the largest suppliers in our industry certainly do say that they are diversified, that they have sourcing in different countries. They're not limited to just one, and that they're able to move production around much better than they were, say, a decade ago, where they were just like, hey, we have this factory in China and that's it. So that's great to keep in mind too, but it doesn't negate the challenges coming out of a place like Bangladesh. One other thing that you made a really great point, I think, about sourcing diversification there, one of it actually speaks to another little issue that comes up, which is that folks or apparel producers in our industry and in retail and other industries have increasingly looked to Africa to set up shop for apparel production. One of the most notable is Sanmar. Sanmar has created thousands and thousands of jobs in Africa through the factories that they've set up there, which is a fantastic thing for everybody. Problem is that there's a major trade agreement with sub-Saharan African nations that is set to expire and needs renewal in order for a lot of the advantageous, I don't know, call it. So it makes it more advantageous to source from these countries with this agreement in place from a cost and logistics perspective. So that needs to be AGOA is the acronym for it. That needs to be re-upped. There's a lot of will on both sides of the political aisle, Republican and Democrat, to renew it and to hopefully do so in early 2025. No one's really against it, but the devil is in the details, and they're talking about certain things that could impact our industry negatively. For instance, Africa doesn't yet have a lot of the or all of, I should say, the necessary infrastructure in place to get like raw materials processed and sourced correctly. So you might produce the garment in Africa, but you might have to bring in quite a bit of stuff from other countries, particularly Asia. And there's questions among some legislators, like, does that still really count as made in Africa? Does that still really qualify under AGOA? And folks like Samar say, oh my gosh, yes, it has to, or we're not going to be able to produce there. So it's just another one of these developments in the global supply chain that I think we need to keep our eye on and hopefully see shake out in the right way for our industry.
Yeah, I think to your point, like so much of why China is still kind of at the top is the infrastructure. I mean, they have the infrastructure to get the raw materials in, to produce the goods, and to get them out. And that's so like, and they have, I mean, for now, they have the labor force. They have so many people who work in that industry and manufacturing and making these products. But I mean, I think that's changing too. I think the labor force, I think a lot of people want desk jobs. They don't want to work in a factory, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
that's kind of old school. So I mean, I think that's definitely going to impact China's, presence in our industry, in a lot of industries, but for us in promo. But they have the design expertise. They're making, these kind of innovative products, whereas other countries, you might give them schematics, but they don't necessarily innovate with new products. Like, you go to the Canton Fair or the Hong Kong Fair, right, with these new products. Other countries don't have that. They are given schematics to make them, but they don't have the innovation to create their own.
Right.
So that's another part of why China is still on top. And it looks like, from SOI data, it looks like people are planning to increase their their spend with China and sourcing from China.
Yeah.
So
because of all the reasons you mentioned, it's like the manufacturing muscles there, the raw materials are there, the expertise is there. It makes sense.
yeah.
Interesting stuff. I guess we're kind of running up against it a little bit here. So maybe just final thoughts. Any final thoughts for everybody just on supply chain, where you think all this might be headed? Could be anything.
Oh yeah, it's going to be, and like us here, it's going to be constant monitoring of the situation, for both, the rail situation in Canada, the strike on the east and Gulf Coast ports.
Mhm.
And I just think everyone's got to be prepared. I don't think it's as much of a jump scare as shocking to the system as maybe like if this was 2019, right? It'd be
Yeah,
like, oh my gosh.
yeah.
But with COVID, I think people have just gotten like a thick skin about it. And
Hmm.
I think, thankfully, I think end buyers are pretty used to this kind of thing too. So,
Hmm.
I don't think it's as much of again, a shock to the system, but still, it still behooves everyone to kind of stay ahead of it, be prepared, order
Hmm.
early, manage expectations, keep lines of communication open with everybody, with
Hmm.
your suppliers, with your factories, with your end buyers. Everyone's got to be, constant communication. So I think
Hmm.
that's the main thing.
Yeah, I really couldn't say it any better. I'll just add maybe be a little bit of a cheerleader here for a moment for industry suppliers. Certainly the better ones for sure
Hmm.
are very aware of this, and they have people working on this daily, trying to keep
Yes.
the product coming in, trying to keep it stocked, and they're dealing with what's been 5 years now of the immediate supply. The supply chain crisis is over, but supply chain disruption is almost endemic now to
Yeah.
global supply lines, and it's just something that they're working through. So everybody, like you said, everybody, let's try to work together with some empathy and keep
Yeah.
the business of the industry moving, right?
Absolutely.
All right, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today. I
Thanks,
appreciate
Chris.
it.